We're going to continue here on page 268, land management, and follow along in your textbook. Actually, that's the wrong page. We're going to start on page 265. Here we go. Okay, protected lands are classified according to their use. All around the world, countries are protecting lands, and you can see the designations all around the world. Amazing, really, to think that worldwide we have such cooperation when it comes to protecting lands. And you can see national protections are, for instance, these blue areas here. And internationally protected areas are in yellow. Of course, we have the Amazon basin here in South America. Those countries are protecting those. We have the great forests of Russia and Europe up here. It's a big area. And of course, most of Alaska is protected areas, as you can tell here. Not so much here in the middle United States, but we have lots of protected areas here in the West. In fact, we're going to see that again here in a few minutes. Other areas of interest might be the Himalayas and down here in Southeast Africa. All good examples of areas around the world that are protected. I have some statistics for you here. It's about 11%. I guess about 11% of the world's public lands are categorized or protected in some way or another. Earth's land area about 15 billion hectares, and remember, a hectare is about there's about 2.5 acres in a hectare. And you can see we're not the only country that has national parks. We have plenty. We're going to cover them here in a minute. But all around the world there are national parks. 400 million hectares, 440 million hectares of resource protected areas. When you see this, you should think mining. You should think of minerals. Habitat and species management, we have about 300 million hectares here. About 200 million hectares are wilderness areas and nature reserves. And here's another 100 here for landscapes, and then national monuments, about 28 million hectares.
During the 1960s, the French government decided that because the landscape and culture of the country were so intertwined, they needed to be protected and maintained together. The result was the development of the French Regional Nature Park System. Unlike typical national parks, the regional nature parks are developed on privately owned agricultural lands possessing important ecological and cultural values, and chartered by an organization of local administrations. One of the earliest parks, the 100,000-acre Brier Regional Park in the Loire-Atlantique region, utilizes land use regulations to both promote and control economic activity and development in the region. At the heart of the Brier Regional Park is a large marsh covering 17,000 acres that the local residents have held in common for hundreds of years. This common area is used as pastures for horses, cattle, and sheep. New houses in the area are required to follow the traditional thatched roof architecture. Reeds are harvested from the marsh in order to provide the thatch. The construction and repair of thatched roofs provides employment for local craftspersons. Channels in the marsh resulting from the removal of the reeds provide habitat for wildlife, such as eels, ducks, and geese. Harvesting of this wildlife provides income for the local economy. There are now 40 regional nature parks in France protecting a wide diversity of lands. During the 1960s, the French government decided that because the landscape and culture of the country...
Why do I play that video? ACE students. Great example of European land management for you on your ACE exam. They don't like to just hear about U.S. things when you can mention something a little bit more worldwide. Here in the U.S., we have a concept that's called multiple use lands. And what that means is our organizations set aside our public lands for multiple uses. Might be for logging, it might be for mining. It's not just set aside. They're protected lands. They are public lands. That this land belongs to you and me. So when you think of public lands in the U.S., you should think of land that we own. We try to administer something called the resource conservation ethic whenever we can. And of course what that means is people should maximize the resource based on the greatest good for everyone. So we're constantly balancing here in the United States our multiple use lands so that mining can happen, so that logging can happen. I mean, after all, we need these resources to make the things that we consume. Like all of the iron ore that's necessary for making metal. All of the things that you know that have metal in them. So there's a constant sort of battle between the resource conservation ethic and the multiple use ethic. And these different organizations, government organizations, are constantly trying to straddle that fine line and do a good job on both resource conservation and multiple use. These are some of the most common government agencies that control lands. We have the Bureau of Land Management. Write these down so you know them. The Bureau of Land Management. And their principal focus is on grazing, mining, and timber harvesting. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I'm sorry, this is the U.S. Forest System or Service. The U.S. Forest Service. That's your rangers out there in the woods. That's for timber harvesting and grazing as well. Then we have the National Park Service. The National Park Service is, you see those guys, if you've ever been to a national park, they wear the Smokey the Bear hats. And the National Park Service, of course, operates all of those parks and recreation. Mostly National Park Service lands are for recreation. And then we have the Fish and Wildlife Service. And they're all about wildlife conservation and hunting regulations. And of course all of these are about recreation. Most of these multiple use lands you can go to. Maybe you and your family have actually vacationed by going to one of the public lands here in the United States that are operated chiefly by one of these four organizations. Bureau of Land Management, United States Forest Service, National Park Service, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. Great graphics here. This map really lays out for you and lets you see how much of the western United States is owned by us, you and me. Look at all of the public land in the western U.S. And of course there's a good reason for that. There's a lot of resources out there. Whether it's Forest Service, look at all the forest stuff all the way up here in Washington State, Idaho, lots of forest activity. And national parks, let's take a look at Florida and see what we have here. Have you ever driven on Route 301 south, Ocala? There's even a sign that says you are now entering the Ocala National Forest. So even though interstates and U.S. roads might run right through them, these are public lands. And here's a national park down here in South Florida. Anybody know what that is? You're right, it's the Everglades National Park. Here's how we use our lands here in the U.S. This pie chart is showing you public and private land in the United States. So this is land based on its purpose. And you can see we have a pretty wide distribution here when it comes to how we use our lands. Grasslands and grazing, 25%. That's the biggest. Timber production. We are big on our timber production. And about 1% of our land is military bases that we have set aside. Here's our urban environments. A lot of people living in this very little piece of the pie. And then we have land set aside for recreation and wildlife. I think you get the idea. And land that nobody really bothers to use. Deserts and tundras and stuff like that. Also notice over here on this U.S. map, Alaska. Look at how much of Alaska is public land. This is the area of concern when we talk about the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. That is right around here. And the Bureau of Land Management and Fish and Wildlife Service operate those. Now we're going to get into land management practices because it's the next thing in the textbook, but we won't be able to get through all of it in this video, or else the video will be way too long. So let's hear from the forest ranger here to get things started when we talk about our land management practices. This begins on page 268. We'll cover managing rangelands, forests, and then forest gets quite involved, and then we'll talk about our national parks and our wildlife refuges.
I'm a ranger with the National Park Service. The National Park Service maintains 385 of the nation's natural and cultural areas, everything from the Statue of Liberty to the beach at Cape Cod to, well, where we are now, the Santa Monica Mountains National Recreation Area. The Santa Monica Mountains actually is a mountain range that spans Los Angeles, and we're figuring out how things live together. We have mountain lions and bobcats and coyotes and foxes that live in these hills, and they call this place home. When you have 33 million people that want to visit this area, you're presented with the issue of, well, how do you get people so that they can get in to see these animals or see the vegetation or enjoy the land or even just sit beside a quiet brook. One of the biggest things that we've done is that we've really given a lot of attention to our trail system because it's a gentle way of getting people into the land. The National Park Service works with...
All right, so there's some good examples of how we try to manage even that land. We allow people in to enjoy the nature, but hey, we got to be careful. We can't have them destroying habitats any more than possible. These are public lands, and once again, there's a constant balancing act, a give and take between protecting these areas, but since they are public lands, giving the population access to them. All right, let's start with rangelands. Rangelands are managed primarily by the Bureau of Land Management, and the environmental issues are something called overgrazing. You've probably heard that term before, and you can tell what that means. Too many cows, horses, whatever it is that people are growing, primarily for food, overusing our grasslands for cattle grazing. So the usage of these rangelands has to be managed, and that's what the Bureau of Land Management does. For instance, they will probably have an area of 100,000 hectares. They'll probably have 20% of it cordoned off for non-use, and that's to let the grassland come back, to let those grasses come back, because after all, these cattle chew on that grass and it's got to grow back. If you bring the same cattle back year after year on the same land, there's going to be less and less grass. And of course, the cattle can also do damage to the soil degradation. So we have to rotate the grazing opportunities on our grasslands, our prairies, just like we have to rotate crops if you're a farmer. This is much more land that we're talking about, but I think you get the idea. Dry, open grasslands can be used up way too quickly if we're not careful. The Taylor Grazing Act of 1934 was the first opportunity by the government to sort of control the grazing activities that were happening and to try to hold down soil erosion. You might remember the old story about the Dust Bowl. That was primarily a story of overgrazing at first. And remember, grasses are rather fragile organisms, so they need to be handled carefully. The best way to do that is to just set aside areas so that they won't be used at all for a year or two. Let those grasses come back before we start grazing cattle on them again. There's a lot to say about forests, and I want to get into some of our forestry practices here. You know, we've talked about farming practices before, and there's definitely an environmental approach to harvesting timber, and there's the quickest, easiest, safest way. In fact, that's what I want us to jot down right now. Think about this. Let's start with clear cutting. Clear cutting is the least environmentally friendly way to cut down trees. Well, you can imagine, you're just going to cut down an entire forest. Wipe it slick. Not going to be a lot of opportunities for these trees, and it's going to take years for that forest to come back. And of course, that's habitat destruction. No furry little creatures can run around in the forest anymore if we went in there and cut down all the trees. And it would take a long time for regrowth to occur. And once regrowth occurs, you'll see we'll have all of the same aged trees in that forest. That is not biodiversity. And so only certain animals will come back to live in a forest that has all the same types of trees. But it's cheaper, it's faster, and it's safer. Think about it. These guys come in and cut down these trees just one at a time. Timber! Down goes the tree, next tree, next tree, and they just cut right into the forest and clear cut the whole area. Very easy to do. Selective cutting is much more difficult because you're having to walk through the trees constantly. You're going to cut down one tree and another tree, but certain trees you're going to leave standing. Well, this is more dangerous for the foresters, for the guys cutting down the trees. It's more time consuming and it costs a lot more. So selective cutting is the better environmental approach, but it costs more, and it's a little bit less safe for those guys that are in the woods cutting down the trees. You can see what ends up happening with regrowth. We end up with lots of different aged trees in the forest. So when these new trees come back in a couple of years, you've got a nice uneven aged forest, lots of different species of tree, and all the furry little creatures are living here. In fact, when we selectively cut in an area, the furry little creatures will run away because the humans are in there cutting down trees, but there's still a forest. It's a thinned out forest, but there's still a forest, there's still some habitat, and the furry little creatures can come back. This idea of ecologically sustainable forestry is the goal of maintaining both plants, i.e. trees, and also animals in a forest, and keep it in its natural state as much as possible. More and more companies now are trying to use this ethic, the ecologically sustainable forest. And when companies do that, they stamp on the wood that they get from those forests, certified sustainably grown. You can find this in Home Depot. Anytime you need to go buy a 2x4, you need to buy some wood, you want to buy from a company that has this stamped on it, because that means they did not clear cut. They didn't take the easy way. They didn't do the cheapest thing because it's most damaging to the environment. Instead, certified sustainably grown wood means they did selective cutting. And if you will support and buy from companies that do this, they're hoping by stamping it on their wood that you will choose their wood over somebody else's wood because they did it in a more environmentally sensitive way. And it's not just the fact that they selective cut when they go into a forest, but also that they replant all their trees.
Forest trees can be harvested by several methods, each affecting the local ecosystem in different ways. Moderate to fully mature trees are cut singly or in small groups in a method known as selective cutting. By allowing most trees to remain, wildlife habitat is protected and soil erosion is prevented. Seed tree cutting involves removal of most trees in an area, except for a few scattered trees which provide seeds for regrowth. Forests cut in this manner tend to lose their diversity. Strip cutting involves the complete removal of trees from narrow consecutive strips of land. The strips are removed over a period of years so that some trees, either uncut or regrowth, remain to provide habitat and prevent erosion. The method of clear cutting involves the complete removal of trees from a relatively large area. This method is the most destructive to habitat and can lead to severe erosion of clear-cut slopes.
All right, so those are some of the different types of timber cutting practices that we see here in the United States. Lots of environmental damage as a result of logging, deforestation, and reforestation. And I think I'll pick up with that concept in the next video. Talk to you later. Bye for now.